The gunshot echoed through the night, shattering the stillness that had settled over the rolling plains of Arizona Territory. Josephine Mercer's heart pounded in her chest as she urged her exhausted mare forward, the beast's labored breathing matching her own desperate gasps. Blood trickled down her arm where the bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't stop, not with Daniel Blackwell's men still pursuing her through the darkness of 1876. "Just a little further, girl," she whispered to the horse, her voice barely audible above the animal's thundering hooves. The silhouette of a homestead appeared on the horizon, a lone sentinel against the vast emptiness of the frontier. A barn shelter somewhere to hide until she could figure out her next move. Josephine had been running for 3 days now, ever since she'd stumbled upon Blackwell's operation. The memory of what she'd witnessed made her stomach turn. The cattle rustling was bad enough, but the murder of Sheriff Collins had sealed her fate. If they caught her, she was as good as dead. The barn loomed larger as she approached, and Josephine offered a silent prayer of thanks. No lights burned in the nearby house. With luck, she could slip inside unnoticed, rest until dawn, and be gone before anyone discovered her presence. She dismounted with shaking legs, nearly collapsing as her feet touched the ground. Leading the mare into the shadowy interior of the barn, Josephine found an empty stall in the back corner. She unsaddled her horse, her movements clumsy with exhaustion and pain, then used the last of her water to wet a handkerchief and clean her wound as best she could. The hayloft above offered the perfect hiding place. Josephine climbed the ladder one-handed, her injured arm protesting with every movement, and collapsed into the sweet-smelling hay. Within moments, despite her fear and the throbbing pain in her arm, darkness claimed her. Ethan Jameson rose before the sun, as he did every morning. At 32, he'd established a comfortable routine on the small ranch he'd built over the past 8 years. The 20 acres outside Mineral Park weren't much compared to some of the cattle barren spreads, but the land was his, paid for with years of hard work and careful saving. He pulled on his worn boots and shrugged into his shirt, running a hand through his sandy brown hair before settling his hat on his head. The coffee would have to wait, the animals needed tending first. He crossed the yard to the barn, the pre-dawn air crisp against his skin. The moment he stepped inside, Ethan knew something was amiss. His gelding nickered a greeting from his stall, but there was another sound, the soft breathing of a second horse. Frowning, he moved deeper into the barn and found the strange mare, her coat dark with sweat despite the cool night. "Where'd you come from, girl?" he murmured, running a hand along her neck. The horse was exhausted but well-bred, not the kind of animal typically found wandering loose in this part of the territory. A slight sound from above caught his attention. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip as he approached the ladder to the hayloft. In these parts, a man couldn't be too careful. Rustlers and outlaws were common enough, and a lone rancher made an easy target. Carefully, he ascended the ladder, each rung creaking softly beneath his weight. The pale light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the barn walls revealed a figure huddled in the hay. A woman, he realized with surprise, her dark hair falling across her face and her clothes stained with what looked unmistakably like blood. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. She could be dangerous. Plenty of women on the frontier were as deadly as any man, but the pallor of her skin and the makeshift bandage around her arm suggested she was more likely a victim than a threat. "Madam," he called softly, keeping a respectful distance. Josephine jolted awake, scrambling backward with wild eyes. "Stay back," she warned, her hand moving to her side where a small derringer would have been had she not lost it somewhere during her desperate flight. "Easy now," Ethan said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. This is my barn you're sleeping in." Josephine's vision swam, the man before her blurring and doubling as she fought to remain conscious. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I just needed somewhere to rest." "I'll be gone as soon as—" She swayed dangerously, her wound having bled more than she'd realized during the night. Ethan moved forward instinctively as she began to collapse, catching her before she could hit the hard wooden floor of the loft. You're injured, he observed, taking in the blood-stained sleeve of her dress and the feverish heat radiating from her skin. Whatever trouble you're in, you won't get far in this condition. They'll kill me if they find me, Josephine whispered, her eyes fluttering as she fought to stay conscious. Who will? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing with concern, but Josephine had already slipped into unconsciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder. Ethan hesitated only a moment before making his decision. He couldn't in good conscience leave an injured woman in his barn, especially not one who was clearly running for her life. With careful movements, he gathered her into his arms and descended the ladder, managing the awkward burden with practiced ease. As he carried her across the yard toward his house, he scanned the horizon for any sign of riders. The land remained peaceful, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was headed his way. "You're welcome in my house instead," he murmured to the unconscious woman, pushing open his front door with his shoulder. "At least until we figure out who's after you and why." Josephine awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of a soft bed beneath her and the scent of coffee in the air. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then the events of the previous days came flooding back, and she sat up with a gasp, wincing as pain shot through her arm. The room was small but neat, with simple furniture and curtains that softened the morning light. Her arm had been properly bandaged, and someone had removed her boots, but otherwise left her fully clothed, a consideration she appreciated. The door opened, and the man from the barn entered, carrying a steaming mug. He paused when he saw she was awake, offering a cautious smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Thought you might want some coffee when you woke up." Josephine regarded him warily. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with clear blue eyes that met hers directly. "Thank you," she said, accepting the mug with her good hand. "And thank you for tending to my arm." "It wasn't too deep, thankfully," he replied, keeping a respectful distance. "I cleaned it and bandaged it best I could. My name's Ethan Jameson, by the way. This is my ranch." "Josephine Mercer," she offered after a moment's hesitation. There seemed little point in lying about her name. Blackwell's men already knew who she was. "Well, Miss Mercer, I don't mean to pry, but you mentioned someone was trying to kill you. I reckon I've earned the right to know what kind of trouble might be heading my way." Josephine sipped the coffee, using the moment to gather her thoughts. "I witnessed something I shouldn't have," she finally said. "Daniel Blackwell and his men murdered Sheriff Collins in Prescott. I was working as a telegraph operator there and stayed late to catch up on some messages. I saw them drag the sheriff into the alley behind the office. When they spotted me watching, I ran." Ethan's expression darkened. "Blackwell has a bad reputation. Word is he's built quite an operation. Rustling protection rackets may be worse. If his men are after you, they won't give up easily." "I know," Josephine said softly. "I'm sorry to have brought this to your doorstep. Once I've rested, I'll move on." "And go where?" Ethan challenged. "You're still weak from blood loss, and from the looks of your horse, you've been riding hard for days." "Blackwell's men are probably searching every settlement between here and Prescott." "I can't stay here," she insisted. "I won't put you in danger." "My nearest neighbor is 5 miles away and I don't get many visitors," Ethan said. "You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel and until we can figure out a safer destination for you." Josephine wanted to refuse, to insist she could take care of herself. But the truth was, she was exhausted, injured, and terrified. The kindness in this stranger's eyes offered the first glimmer of hope she'd felt since fleeing Prescott. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Ethan's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "My pa taught me never to turn away someone in need. Besides, I've had my own run-ins with men like Blackwell. I know what they're capable of." Before Josephine could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Ethan moved quickly to the window, peering through the curtains. 3 riders, he reported, his voice tight. "Coming fast." Josephine's heart seemed to stop. "Blackwell's men," she whispered. "They've found me." Ethan's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "Stay here," he instructed, moving to a cabinet on the far wall. He retrieved a shotgun, checking it was loaded before heading toward the door. "And keep down." Left alone, Josephine moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. The three men had reined in their horses in front of the house, dust settling around them in the morning light. She recognized the leader immediately, Frank Miller, Blackwell's right-hand man. The sight of him sent ice through her veins. Ethan stepped onto his porch, shotgun held casually but ready. His stance was relaxed, but Josephine could sense the tension in his shoulders. "Morning, gentlemen," he called. "Something I can help you with?" Miller dismounted, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the dirt. He was a big man with a face like carved stone, his eyes cold beneath the brim of his hat. "Looking for a woman," he said without preamble. "Dark hair, about 25, riding a bay mare. Seen anyone matching that description?" "Can't say that I have," Ethan replied easily. "Don't get many travelers through these parts. What's she done?" "Thief," Miller said, the lie rolling smoothly off his tongue. "Stole a considerable sum from my employer in Prescott. We've been tracking her for days." "That's so." Ethan's tone remained conversational. "Well, if I see her, I'll be sure to let the sheriff in Mineral Park know." Miller's eyes narrowed. "We'd prefer to handle it ourselves." "The money belongs to my employer, after all." "Seems like a matter for the law to me," Ethan countered. The tension between the men was palpable. Miller's companions shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Josephine held her breath, fear clutching at her throat. After what seemed an eternity, Miller nodded curtly. "We'll keep looking then, but if you do see her, remember she's dangerous. Killed a man back in Prescott before she ran." Ethan's expression didn't change, but Josephine could see the tightening of his jaw. "I'll keep that in mind." Miller mounted his horse and turned to leave, then paused. "Nice bay mare you've got in your corral," he observed. "Looks tired. Traded for her yesterday in town," Ethan replied without missing a beat. "Previous owner rode her hard, been giving her a rest before I start working with her." Miller studied him for a long moment, clearly suspicious but unable to prove anything. Finally, he nodded to his companions and they rode away, dust swirling in their wake. Ethan remained on the porch until the riders disappeared from view, then returned to the house, his face grim. "They'll be back," he said as he set the shotgun aside. "Miller didn't believe me about the horse." Josephine sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I've put you in terrible danger." "They're saying you killed someone in Prescott," Ethan said, watching her carefully. "That's a lie," Josephine replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Blackwell killed Sheriff Collins. I witnessed it. Now they're trying to frame me for the murder to discredit my testimony if I ever make it to a federal marshal." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you," he said simply, "but we need a plan. Miller will report back to Blackwell and they'll return with more men." "I should leave," Josephine insisted. "Take my chances on the trail and go where?" Ethan challenged. "You need time to heal and they're watching the roads. Besides, they've seen your horse now. You wouldn't make it 5 miles. He was right, and Josephine knew it. She was trapped, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to except this stranger who had already risked his life for her. "The nearest federal marshal is in Tucson," Ethan continued. "That's a hard 4-day ride and they'll be watching for you. We need to buy some time, get you stronger, and figure out a way to get you safely to someone who can help." "We," Josephine echoed, surprised by his continued willingness to involve himself in her troubles. Ethan's expression softened slightly. "I'm already involved, Miss Mercer." Might as well see it through. For the first time in days, Josephine felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Jameson." "Ethan," he corrected. "If we're going to be facing down Blackwell's gang together, we might as well use first names." Despite everything, Josephine found herself smiling. "Josephine, then," she said. "Or Josie to my friends." "Well, Josie," Ethan said, returning her smile with a warmth that reached his eyes, "I think we'd better start making preparations. Blackwell's men won't wait long before they return." The next 3 days established a cautious routine. Ethan tended to his ranch work during the day, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon, while Josephine recovered her strength. Her wound began to heal cleanly, and the color returned to her cheeks as she rested and ate well. In the evenings, they shared meals at Ethan's small table, talking long into the night. Josephine learned that Ethan had come west after the war, seeking a fresh start after losing his family's farm in Tennessee. He'd worked cattle drives and as a deputy before saving enough to buy his own land. In turn, she told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a physician who had encouraged her education, unusual for a girl, and her journey west after her parents' death from influenza. "I wanted adventure," she admitted on the third night, smiling ruefully as she helped him clear the dishes. "I'd read stories about the frontier and thought it sounded romantic. And has it been?" Ethan asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Parts of it," Josephine replied. "Though being chased by murderous outlaws wasn't in the stories I read." Ethan laughed, the sound warming something inside her that had been cold for too long. "No, I suppose not." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of horses. Ethan moved swiftly to douse the lamp, then peered out the window into the moonlit yard. "4 riders," he reported quietly, "coming slow, trying to be stealthy." Josephine's heart pounded. "Blackwell's men, almost certainly." Ethan retrieved his rifle from beside the door. "They're trying to catch us unawares. Take the shotgun and go to the root cellar. There's a trapdoor under the rug in the pantry." "I won't hide while you face them alone," Josephine protested. "Josie, please," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "I can handle myself better if I'm not worrying about you being caught in the crossfire." The look in his eyes, concern, mixed with something deeper that she wasn't ready to name, convinced her. Josephine took the shotgun and followed his directions to the pantry, lifting the corner of the rug to reveal the trapdoor he'd described. "Be careful," she whispered before descending into the darkness below. The root cellar was cool and smelled of earth and stored vegetables. Josephine left the trapdoor slightly ajar, allowing her to hear what transpired above. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, straining her ears for any sound. Finally, she heard the creak of the front door opening, followed by cautious footsteps across the wooden floor. Then Ethan's voice, deceptively calm, "That's far enough, gentlemen. I'm not fond of uninvited guests, especially those who come calling after dark." A harsh laugh answered him. "Where's the woman, Jameson? We know she's here." "I already told Miller I haven't seen any woman," Ethan replied. "Now I suggest you leave my property before things get unpleasant. 4 guns against 1, another voice sneered. "Those odds don't favor you." "Maybe not," Ethan agreed, "but I guarantee I'll take at least 2 of you with me. Who wants to be first?" The tense silence that followed was broken by a new voice, one that sent chills down Josephine's spine. Daniel Blackwell himself had come. "Mr. Jameson," he said, his tone urbane and cultured, at odds with his murderous nature. "I understand your reluctance to become involved in this affair. The woman has clearly lied to you about her crimes." "The only crime I've witnessed," Ethan replied evenly, "is trespassing on my land after dark. That makes me suspicious of your intentions." "Let me be clear," Blackwell continued as if Ethan hadn't spoken. "Josephine Mercer is a thief and a murderer. She killed a respected lawman in Prescott and fled with evidence that rightfully belongs to me. Return her to my custody, and I'll forget your involvement in harboring a fugitive." "That's quite an accusation," Ethan said. "Do you have a warrant for her arrest?" Blackwell's laugh held no humor. "We're a long way from a courthouse, Mr. Jameson. Out here, justice is more immediate." "Sounds like you're describing vigilantism, not justice," Ethan observed. "In any case, there's no woman here." "You're welcome to search the place if you don't believe me." Josephine's breath caught. Was Ethan inviting them to find her hiding place? "We intend to," Blackwell replied coldly. Heavy footsteps moved throughout the house, doors opening and closing as the men searched. Josephine gripped the shotgun tightly, her palms slick with sweat, if they found the trapdoor. The footsteps approached the pantry and dust filtered down as someone walked directly overhead. Josephine held her breath, finger tense on the trigger. "Nothing here, boss," a voice called after what seemed an eternity. "Check the barn," Blackwell ordered. The footsteps receded and Josephine released her breath slowly. Minutes ticked by as the search continued outside. Finally, the men returned. "Satisfied?" Ethan asked, his tone neutral. "For now," Blackwell replied. "But understand this, Mr. Jameson, the woman will be found, and anyone who aids her will share her fate." "Is that a threat?" Ethan's voice had hardened. "Consider it friendly advice," Blackwell said. Good night, Mr. Jameson. We'll be watching your ranch. The door closed and silence fell. Josephine remained frozen in place, afraid to move until she was certain they were truly gone. After what seemed hours but was likely only minutes, the trapdoor lifted fully and Ethan's face appeared. "They're gone," he said, offering his hand to help her climb out. "But they've left a man watching the house from the ridge to the east." Josephine emerged from the cellar on shaky legs. "They'll keep coming back," she said, setting the shotgun carefully aside. "And eventually they'll find me." Ethan nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to leave tonight. Pack whatever you can carry. We'll take the horses through the creek bed to mask our trail." "Where will we go?" Josephine asked, already moving to gather her few belongings. "I have a friend, Jacob Turner, who has a place near the Hualapai Mountains. It's remote, and he owes me a favor. We can shelter there while we figure out how to get you safely to a federal marshal." They worked quickly and quietly, gathering supplies and preparing the horses. Ethan packed ammunition, food, canteens, and bedrolls, moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to traveling light. By midnight, they were ready. Ethan led the way, guiding his gelding and Josephine's mare through the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the land. They stayed in the shallow creek for nearly a mile before climbing the bank and heading west, toward the distant mountains that loomed like shadows against the star-filled sky. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As dawn broke, Ethan led them into a small canyon where a stand of cottonwoods offered shelter and water. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, dismounting stiffly. "It's not safe to travel during daylight yet. We're still too close to Mineral Park." Josephine slid from her saddle, wincing as her wounded arm protested the movement. The night's ride had taken a toll on her still healing body, but she wouldn't complain. Ethan had abandoned his home and livelihood to help her. The least she could do was bear her discomfort silently. They ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hardtack, washing it down with water from the creek. As Josephine leaned against a cottonwood trunk, exhaustion finally overtaking her, she studied Ethan's profile in the growing light. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You've given up everything to help a stranger." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. "6 years ago," he finally said, "I witnessed a man being murdered in a mining camp near Tombstone. I testified against the killer's members of a local gang. They were hanged, but their friends came after me." His hand moved unconsciously to a scar that ran along his jawline. "I barely escaped with my life. No one stood with me then." He turned to meet her gaze. "I couldn't call myself a man if I turned you away." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep inside Josephine. "Thank you," she whispered, "though I fear I've brought you nothing but trouble." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've weathered trouble before, Josie, and this time at least I have good company." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Josephine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. Despite their desperate circumstances, or perhaps because of them, a connection was forming between them, fragile but undeniable. They rested through the heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the other slept. As dusk approached, they prepared to continue their journey. "We should reach Jacob's place by morning if we ride through the night," Ethan said as he tightened his saddle girth. "It's rough country, but the horses can manage it." Josephine nodded, checking her mare's bridle. "I'm ready whenever you are." As Ethan turned to mount his horse, a shot rang out, the bullet striking the tree beside him. Instantly, he dove for cover, pulling Josephine down with him. "They've found us," he hissed, drawing his revolver. "Get to the horses, I'll cover you." "No," Josephine protested. "I won't leave you." "We don't have time to argue," Ethan said, his eyes intense. "On my signal, run for the horses. I'll be right behind you." Before she could object further, Ethan fired several shots in the direction the bullet had come from, then shouted. "Now!" Josephine ran, keeping low, her heart pounding in her ears. She reached the horses and untied them quickly, swinging into the saddle just as Ethan appeared beside her, firing once more before mounting his own horse. "Ride," he commanded, and they urged their mounts forward, racing out of the canyon as bullets kicked up dust around them. The pursuit continued for miles, their horses laboring up steep slopes and through narrow ravines as they tried to shake their pursuers. Josephine rode as she never had before, bent low over her mare's neck, trusting the animal's sure-footedness in the treacherous terrain. As they crested a ridge, Ethan suddenly pulled up sharply. Ahead, the land dropped away into a deep gorge, a thin stream glinting far below in the moonlight. "We're trapped," Josephine gasped, hearing the sounds of their pursuers drawing closer. Ethan's expression was grim as he surveyed their options. "There's a trail down," he said, pointing to a narrow path that switched back down the cliff face. "It's dangerous but passable if we take it slow. They'll catch us before we're halfway down," Josephine pointed out. "Not if I hold them off while you go ahead," Ethan replied. "I know these canyons. I can lose them and circle back to meet you at the bottom." "That's too risky," she protested. "You can't face them alone." "Josie," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm, "trust me, I'm not planning on dying today." The sounds of pursuit grew louder. There was no time for further debate. Josephine swallowed her fear and nodded. "Be careful," she whispered. "Always am," he replied with a quick smile. "Now go, I'll find you." With a last glance at him, Josephine guided her mare onto the narrow trail. The descent was harrowing, loose stones skittering beneath the horse's hooves and tumbling into the abyss below. Behind her, she heard the sharp crack of gunfire as Ethan engaged their pursuers. It took all her concentration to navigate the treacherous path, and by the time she reached the bottom, the sounds of fighting had faded. Josephine dismounted in the shelter of a large boulder, loosening her mare's girth to allow the exhausted animal to rest while she waited anxiously for Ethan. 1 hour stretched into 2. Josephine's fear grew with each passing minute. Had Ethan been captured? Or worse, just as she was considering the impossible task of climbing back up to search for him, a sound caught her attention: the soft scrabble of hooves on stone. She raised her gun, prepared to defend herself, then nearly sobbed with relief when Ethan appeared, leading his horse down the last section of the trail. "You made it," she breathed as he reached her side. He dismounted stiffly, and in the moonlight, she saw blood staining his shirt. "Caught a bullet in the shoulder," he admitted as she rushed to his side. "Nothing serious, but it stings like hell." "Let me see," Josephine insisted, helping him remove his coat. The wound was a deep graze along his upper arm, bleeding freely but not life-threatening. She tore strips from her petticoat to bind it, working quickly by the dim light. "What happened to Blackwell's men?" she asked as she tied off the bandage. "Lost 2 of them in a rockslide," Ethan replied grimly. "The others pulled back, but they'll regroup once daylight comes." "We need to keep moving." "You're injured," Josephine protested. "You need rest." "We'll rest when we reach Jacob's," Ethan said, his jaw set with determination. "We're still too exposed here." Recognizing the futility of arguing, Josephine helped him back into his coat, and they mounted their horses once more. They followed the canyon floor through the night, the walls rising like dark sentinels on either side as they pushed their tired mounts onward. By dawn, the terrain had changed, the canyon opening into a wider valley dotted with pinyon pines and juniper. Ahead, nestled against the base of a rugged mountain, a small cabin came into view, smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. "Jacob's place," Ethan said, relief evident in his voice. "We made it." As they approached, a man emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand. He was older than Ethan, with a grizzled beard and the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime in the harsh wilderness. "That's far enough," he called, raising his weapon. "Jacob, it's Ethan Jameson." Ethan replied, halting his horse and raising his uninjured arm to show he meant no harm. The man squinted, then lowered his rifle. "Ethan, what in blazes are you doing here?" His gaze shifted to Josephine. "And who's the lady?" "It's a long story," Ethan said wearily. "One best told inside if you're willing to offer shelter." Jacob studied them for a long moment, noting Ethan's bloodied sleeve and their exhausted state. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, Jameson," he finally remarked, but stepped aside to let them pass. "Come on in. Looks like you both could use some hot food and a safe place to rest." The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a few chairs. Jacob set about preparing coffee while Josephine tended more carefully to Ethan's wound, cleaning it thoroughly with water heated on the stove. "So," Jacob said once they were settled with steaming mugs in hand, "what kind of hornet's nest have you kicked this time?" Ethan glanced at Josephine, who nodded her permission. Together, they related the events of the past week, her witnessing of Sheriff Collins's murder, Blackwell's pursuit, and their narrow escape from the canyon. Jacob listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Daniel Blackwell is bad business," he said when they finished. "He's got half the territorial officials in his pocket and enough guns on his payroll to start a small war. We need to get Josie to a federal marshal," Ethan explained. "Someone beyond Blackwell's influence who can protect her until she can testify. The nearest federal marshal is in Tucson," Jacob said, echoing what Ethan had told Josephine days earlier. "But getting there won't be easy. Blackwell will have men watching the trails and settlements along the way." "We can't stay here," Josephine said. "We've already brought danger to your doorstep." Jacob snorted. "Lady, I've lived with danger as my neighbor for 30 years. This mountain's full of old mines and hidden canyons. I know every inch of it, and Blackwell's men don't. You're safer here than anywhere else for the time being." "We need a plan," Ethan said, wincing slightly as he shifted in his chair. "The blood loss and hard ride had taken their toll, and some rest before we can move again." "You both look dead on your feet," Jacob observed. "The bedroom's through there. I'll keep watch." "We can't take your bed," Josephine protested. "You're not," Jacob replied. "I sleep better in a chair by the fire these days anyway. Old bones don't much like lying flat." He waved off further objections. "Go on now. We'll figure out our next move after you've had some sleep." Too exhausted to argue further, Josephine helped Ethan to the small bedroom. It contained a single bed barely wide enough for two and little else. "You take the bed," Ethan said. "I'll make do on the floor." "Don't be ridiculous," Josephine countered. "You're injured and need proper rest. We're both adults. We can share the bed." A hint of color touched Ethan's cheeks, but he nodded, too tired to protest. They removed their boots and outer clothing, then lay side by side atop the quilt, a respectful distance between them despite the bed's narrowness. Despite her exhaustion, Josephine found sleep elusive. Beside her, Ethan's breathing soon deepened, indicating he had succumbed to fatigue. Carefully, she turned to look at him, in sleep. The lines of tension had eased from his face, making him appear younger and more vulnerable. She studied the strong line of his jaw, the slight curl of his sandy hair against his forehead, and felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion. In just a week, this man had become more important to her than anyone had been in years. He had risked everything to protect her, a virtual stranger asking nothing in return. Such men were rare in any place, but especially on the frontier where survival often depended on putting oneself first. As if sensing her gaze, Ethan's eyes flickered open. For a moment, they simply looked at each other in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window. "You should be sleeping," he murmured. "So should you," she replied softly. His hand moved across the quilt to find hers, his fingers warm as they entwined with her own. "We'll find a way through this, Josie, I promise." The simple touch and the quiet conviction in his voice soothed something inside her that had been ragged with fear for too long. Josephine squeezed his hand gently in return. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time since fleeing Prescott, she truly believed it might be possible. They slept then, hands still joined, while outside the cabin, Jacob Turner kept his silent vigil, rifle across his lap and eyes scanning the wilderness he called home. The days at Jacob's cabin fell into a cautious rhythm. While Ethan's wound healed and they regained their strength, they worked on a plan to reach Tucson safely. Jacob proved an invaluable ally, not only providing shelter but also intelligence about Blackwell's operations. "He's got men watching the main trails south," Jacob reported after returning from a scouting trip to a nearby settlement. "And there's a price on both your heads now, dead or alive, though I reckon he prefers dead. How many men does he have looking for us?" Ethan asked as they gathered around the rough table, a crude map spread before them. "Hard to say for certain," Jacob replied, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "At least a dozen that I spotted, but there could be more. They're concentrating on the routes to Tucson, figuring that's where you'd head." "So we need another destination," Josephine concluded, somewhere unexpected. There's a federal judge in Yuma, Jacob suggested. Judge Harrison. He's got a reputation for being incorruptible. If you could reach him, he could arrange protection and take your testimony. Ethan studied the map, tracing potential routes with his finger. Yuma's further west. Blackwell's men are looking for us to head south or east. It might work. The Colorado River runs through there, Jacob added. If you could reach Ehrenberg, you could take a steamer downriver to Yuma. Be a damn sight safer than riding overland the whole way. How do we get to Ehrenberg? Josephine asked, leaning closer to examine the map. There's an old Apache trail through the mountains, Jacob said, indicating a route that skirted the edges of the map. Hardly used these days. Rough country, but if you know the way, it'll get you there. Do you know the way? Ethan asked. Jacob shook his head. Not well enough to guide you, but I know someone who does. He hesitated, glancing between them. There's a man half Apache, half Mexican who lives up in the high country. Name's Carlos Redhawk. He's not fond of company, but he knows every trail in these mountains. If anyone can get you to Ehrenberg unseen, it's him. Will he help us? Josephine questioned. He owes me a debt, Jacob replied simply. I saved his life during a blizzard some years back. He's a man who pays what he owes. The plan was set. Jacob would seek out Carlos Redhawk while Ethan and Josephine remained at the cabin, preparing for the journey ahead. It would take Jacob 2 days to reach the reclusive guide and return with him, assuming Carlos agreed to help. In the meantime, Ethan and Josephine found themselves alone in the small cabin, their shared danger and close quarters fostering an intimacy that grew with each passing hour. They cooked together, tended the horses, and spent the evenings talking by the fire, learning each other's stories in greater detail. What will you do after all this? Ethan asked on the second night as they sat side by side, watching the flames dance in the hearth. When Blackwell is behind bars and you're free, Josephine considered the question. I haven't thought that far ahead, she admitted. My position in Prescott is gone, obviously. I suppose I'll need to find work elsewhere. You could go back east, Ethan suggested, though something in his tone suggested he didn't favor the idea. St. Louis must hold better opportunities than the territories. Perhaps, Josephine agreed, but I've grown to love the West despite everything. There's a freedom here I never found back east. She turned to look at him. What about you? Will you return to your ranch? Ethan sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. If it's still standing, Blackwell's men may have burned it to the ground by now. I'm so sorry, Josephine said softly. Everything you've lost is because of me. No, Ethan replied firmly, turning to face her. It's because of Blackwell and men like him who think they can take what they want through violence and intimidation. Don't carry that burden, Josie. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the determination in his eyes. Without conscious thought, Josephine reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the scar along his jawline. You're a good man, Ethan Jameson, she whispered. His hand came up to cover hers, warm and strong. And you're the bravest woman I've ever met, Josephine Mercer. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Ethan leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened as Josephine responded, her hand sliding to the nape of his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I know the timing is terrible, he murmured. With everything that's happening, life doesn't wait for convenient moments, Josephine interrupted softly. Especially not out here. He smiled at that, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to adore. No, I suppose it doesn't. They kissed again, more urgently this time, the shared peril of recent days heightening their awareness of life's fragility and the precious nature of human connection. When Ethan finally drew back, his eyes were dark with desire but also with respect. We should rest, he said, his voice rough. Jacob could return with Carlos tomorrow, and we'll need our strength for the journey ahead. Josephine nodded, though part of her wished to continue what they had begun. She understood his restraint and appreciated it, even as her body hummed with newfound awareness of him. That night, they shared the small bed again, but this time Ethan's arm encircled her waist, drawing her close against the solid warmth of his chest. Josephine slept more peacefully than she had in weeks, feeling for the first time that perhaps there might be a future beyond the danger that pursued them, a future they might share. Jacob returned the following afternoon, accompanied by a tall, lean man with weathered copper skin and black hair streaked with silver. Carlos Redhawk moved with the silent grace of a predator, his dark eyes missing nothing as he entered the cabin. "This is the woman Blackwell hunts?" he asked without preamble, his gaze assessing Josephine. "Yes," Jacob confirmed, "and my friend Ethan, they need safe passage to Ehrenberg." Carlos nodded once. "I will guide them. We leave at dawn. The journey will take 5 days if we move well. Bring only what you can carry easily." The trails are not kind to heavy loads. His manner was abrupt but not unfriendly. Josephine sensed that he was a man of few words by nature, preferring action to conversation. "Thank you," she said simply. Carlos acknowledged her thanks with another nod. "Blackwell's men patrol the valleys. We must stay high in the mountains where they fear to follow. Can we trust him?" Ethan asked Jacob quietly as they prepared supplies for the journey. "With your life," Jacob replied without hesitation. "Carlos doesn't give his word lightly. If he says he'll get you to Ehrenberg, he will or die trying." They spent the evening finalizing preparations, packing dried meat, hardtack, coffee, and other essentials into saddlebags. Jacob provided extra ammunition and a detailed map of the Colorado River from Ehrenberg to Yuma, marking safe locations to stop along the way. "The steamboat Mojave makes the run to Yuma twice weekly," he explained. "With luck, you'll reach Ehrenberg in time to catch it without a long wait." As night fell, Carlos surprised them by producing a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a mixture of dried herbs and sprinkled them onto the fire. A sweet, pungent aroma filled the cabin. "A prayer for safe journey," he explained, seeing their curious looks. "The old ones taught that it confuses those who wish you harm." Whether from the herbs or simply the exhaustion of recent events, Josephine slept deeply that night, waking only when Ethan gently shook her shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness. "Time to go," he murmured. They departed as the first pale light touched the eastern sky, bidding farewell to Jacob with heartfelt thanks and promises to return someday. Carlos led the way, setting a pace that was challenging but not grueling, clearly mindful of their need to preserve strength for the days ahead. The trail he followed would never have been visible to Josephine's eyes, a faint track that wound through dense pine forests, across rocky slopes, and along the edges of steep canyons. They spoke little during the day, conserving energy for the difficult terrain and remaining alert for any sign of pursuit. At night, they made cold camps, avoiding fires that might attract attention. Carlos taught them to find water in seemingly dry places and to move silently through the wilderness. Despite the constant tension of potential discovery, Josephine found herself appreciating the stark beauty of the mountains, the vast star-filled skies, the proud silhouettes of ponderosa pines against the horizon, the occasional glimpse of deer or elk moving through distant meadows. On the third day, as they traversed a high ridge that offered a panoramic view of the landscape below, Carlos suddenly halted, raising his hand for silence. For several minutes he stood motionless, his eyes scanning the valleys. Then, wordlessly, he pointed. Far below, barely visible to Josephine's untrained eye, a group of riders moved along a trail, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. "Blackwell's men," Carlos confirmed quietly. "They search the lower trails. They do not know the high paths as I do." "How many?" Ethan asked, squinting against the distance. 6, maybe 7, Carlos replied. "They move with purpose. Someone has told them you travel this way." The implication was clear. Despite their precautions, word of their route had reached Blackwell. Josephine felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "Can they reach us here?" she asked. Carlos shook his head. "Not directly. The path ahead descends to cross Eagle Canyon before climbing again. They could intercept us there if they know the crossing point." "Do we have an alternative route?" Ethan questioned. "There is another way," Carlos said slowly. "More difficult. It adds a day to our journey, but it avoids the canyon entirely." "Let's take it," Josephine decided without hesitation. Better to arrive safely a day late than not at all. Carlos nodded approvingly and altered their course, leading them higher into the mountains where the air grew thin and the trails narrower. They picked their way along ledges barely wide enough for the horses, the drop to their right dizzyingly steep. The detour proved wise. As evening approached on the fourth day, Carlos led them to a vantage point from which they could see Eagle Canyon. Even from a distance, they could make out riders positioned at the crossing, waiting in ambush. How did they know? Josephine whispered, shaken by the realization of how close they had come to walking into a trap. Someone who knows these mountains must be guiding them, Carlos said grimly. Perhaps a tracker from one of the settlements. It does not matter. We have avoided them, and tomorrow we will reach the desert approaches to Ehrenberg. That night, as they made camp in a sheltered hollow high above the tree line, Ethan took Josephine's hand in his. We're going to make it, he said softly. One more day, then the river to Yuma. Judge Harrison will hear your testimony and Blackwell will face justice. And after that, she asked, the question that had been in her heart for days finally finding voice. Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. After that, if you're willing, I'd like to rebuild my ranch with you by my side. The simple proposal, offered without flourish but with evident sincerity, brought tears to Josephine's eyes. You want me to stay with you, after all the trouble I've brought. I want you to stay with me because of who you are, Ethan corrected gently. Brave, determined, kind. Because when I think about a future without you in it, it seems empty somehow. Josephine leaned against him, her head finding the now familiar hollow of his shoulder. Yes, she whispered, I'd like that very much. Across the small camp, Carlos pretended not to notice their exchange, but a faint smile touched his lips as he tended to the horses. Love found in dangerous times was often the strongest kind. He had seen it before and recognized its signs. Dawn broke clear and cool on the fifth day of their journey. The terrain changed as they descended from the mountains, pine forests giving way to scrubland, and eventually the arid landscape of the Colorado River basin. By mid-afternoon, they could see the silver ribbon of the river in the distance, and beyond it, the scattered buildings of Ehrenberg. We have been fortunate, Carlos observed as they paused to rest the horses. The final approach is open country. We must move quickly and directly. There is no cover for the last few miles. They mounted again and rode steadily toward the river settlement. As they drew closer, Josephine allowed herself to believe they might truly succeed, that safety was within their grasp after days of tension and fear. The sharp crack of a rifle shattered that illusion. The bullet struck the ground just ahead of Josephine's mare, causing the animal to rear in panic. Ethan was at her side instantly, steadying the horse as Carlos scanned the terrain for the shooter. There. He called, pointing to a low rise to their left where a flash of sunlight on metal had betrayed the rifleman's position. Ride for the settlement, Ethan commanded, drawing his revolver. Don't stop for anything. Not without you, Josephine protested. Go, Ethan insisted. Carlos will cover you. I'll be right behind. Another shot cracked across the open ground, this one coming closer. There was no time for debate. Josephine urged her mare forward, galloping toward Ehrenberg with Carlos flanking her. Behind them, Ethan fired several shots toward the ambusher, then wheeled his horse to follow. The ride became a desperate race, the distance to the settlement seeming to stretch endlessly as bullets kicked up dust around them. Josephine bent low over her mare's neck, the animal's breathing harsh as it gave its all in response to her urging. The buildings of Ehrenberg grew larger. Shouts rose as people noticed the riders approaching at breakneck speed, pursued by gunfire. Several men ran from the livery stable, rifles in hand, ready to defend the settlement against whatever threat approached. Josephine risked a glance behind her and saw Ethan still following, though his horse had fallen back slightly. Relief flooded her until she saw him suddenly slump forward in the saddle. Ethan, she screamed, pulling her mare to a halt despite the danger. Carlos was beside her instantly. Keep going, he commanded. I will get him. Without waiting for her response, he wheeled his mount and galloped back toward Ethan, whose horse had slowed to a walk, its rider barely maintaining his seat. From the settlement, several men had mounted and were riding out to meet them, weapons raised. The distant shooter, seeing reinforcements approaching, fired a few more desultory shots before disappearing over the rise. Josephine watched in agony as Carlos reached Ethan and steadied him in the saddle. They began moving toward the settlement again, but slowly, too slowly. Ethan was clearly injured, perhaps badly. When they finally reached Ehrenberg, willing hands helped Ethan from his horse. His shirt was soaked with blood from a bullet wound high in his chest, his face ashen with pain and blood loss. "Doctor," Josephine gasped, dismounting so quickly she nearly fell. "He needs a doctor. Doc Pearson's place is this way," one of the townsmen said, helping to support Ethan's weight. "Who's after you folks?" "Blackwell's men," Carlos answered tersely. "The woman is a witness to murder. They seek to silence her." The name Blackwell sparked immediate recognition among the townspeople. Daniel Blackwell's reputation extended throughout the territory, his influence and cruelty well known. "Get them to the docks," ordered a gray-haired man who seemed to hold some authority. "And post guards. If Blackwell's involved, there'll be more trouble coming." They carried Ethan to a small building near the center of town. Inside, an elderly man with spectacles directed them to place him on a table in a room that served as a surgery. "Everyone out except the lady," he commanded, already rolling up his sleeves. "I need space to work." Josephine remained at Ethan's side, gripping his hand as the doctor cut away his bloodied shirt to reveal the wound. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone, missing his heart but causing significant bleeding. "You're going to be fine," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as him. "We made it to Ehrenberg. The steamboat will take us to Yuma. Just stay with me." Ethan's eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "Not getting rid of me that easily," he managed, his voice weak but determined. "Still have a ranch to rebuild." The doctor worked efficiently, extracting the bullet and cleaning the wound before stitching it closed. "He's lucky," he told Josephine as he finished bandaging Ethan's shoulder. "The bullet missed anything vital. With rest and care, he should recover fully." Relief made Josephine's knees weak. "Thank you, doctor. No need for thanks. It's what I do." The elderly physician wiped his hands on a cloth. "Now, perhaps you'd like to tell me why you arrived in town with bullets flying?" Josephine hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who nodded slightly. She took a deep breath and explained their situation, the murder she'd witnessed, Blackwell's pursuit, and their desperate journey to reach Judge Harrison in Yuma. The doctor listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Blackwell's a powerful man in these parts," he said when she finished. "But Judge Harrison is a force to be reckoned with in his own right. If anyone can protect you and see justice done, it's him." "The steamboat," Josephine said, suddenly remembering. "Do you know when it next departs for Yuma?" "The Mojave. She docked this morning," the doctor replied. "Scheduled to leave at dawn tomorrow." He glanced at Ethan. "Your friend shouldn't be moved so soon, but staying here is likely more dangerous. Blackwell will have men in town within hours." "We need to be on that steamboat," Ethan said weakly from the table. "I'll arrange it," the doctor promised. "I know the captain. He's no friend to Blackwell. You can rest here tonight. I'll have my son stand guard." True to his word, the doctor made the necessary arrangements. By nightfall, word had spread through Ehrenberg of the visitors and their plight. The small settlement, long chafing under Blackwell's influence in the territory, rallied to their aid. Men with rifles took up positions around the doctor's house, while others kept watch for riders approaching from the desert. Carlos Redhawk, his promise fulfilled by delivering them safely to Ehrenberg, prepared to depart. "My debt to Jacob is paid," he told Josephine as they stood outside the doctor's house in the gathering dusk. "But I will carry word to him that you reached the river." "Thank you," Josephine said, embracing the surprised guide. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Carlos accepted her gratitude with a slight nod, then added, "Your man is strong, he will heal." A rare smile touched his lips. "And you both have hearts of fire. Such spirits are not easily extinguished." With those words, he melted into the shadows, returning to the wilderness he called home. Inside, Ethan had been moved to a proper bed in a small room adjacent to the surgery. Though pale from blood loss, his condition had stabilized, and the doctor was cautiously optimistic about his ability to travel the following day. "It won't be comfortable," he warned, but the river journey is smoother than overland travel. Keep the wound clean and change the bandages daily. When you reach Yuma, see Dr. Martinez. He's a good man." Josephine sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand as night deepened around them. Despite the guards outside and the relative safety of the settlement, she couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwell's reach might yet extend to Ehrenberg before morning. "You're thinking too loud," Ethan murmured, his eyes opening to meet hers. "I can practically hear the worry." She smiled despite herself. "One of us has to worry. You're too busy getting shot." "Only a little shot," he countered, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "and it was worth it to get you here safely." "Don't say that," Josephine admonished, her voice catching. "Nothing is worth losing you." Ethan's expression softened. "Come here," he said, tugging gently at her hand until she moved to sit on the edge of the bed. "We made it this far together. We'll make it the rest of the way." "Promise," she whispered. "Promise," he affirmed, drawing her down for a tender kiss. "Besides, I recall a certain lady agreeing to help rebuild a ranch. Can't leave you to handle all that work alone." Josephine laughed softly, resting her forehead against his. "That would be most ungentlemanly." They spent the night in the doctor's house, Josephine dozing in a chair beside Ethan's bed, unwilling to leave his side even for the comfort of a proper rest. Outside, the men of Ehrenberg maintained their vigil, determined that Blackwell's influence would not reach within their settlement, at least for this one night. Dawn came with no sign of pursuit. The doctor checked Ethan's wound one last time, pronounced himself satisfied with its appearance, and provided fresh bandages and medicine for the journey. With his help and that of several townsmen, they made their way to the riverfront where the steamboat Mojave waited, white steam puffing from its stacks. The vessel was smaller than the grand riverboats Josephine had seen on the Mississippi during her childhood, but its sturdy construction inspired confidence. The captain, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, greeted them at the gangplank. "Doctor Pearson explained your situation," he said without preamble. "I've prepared a cabin for you. It's small but private. We should reach Yuma by tomorrow afternoon if the river cooperates." "Thank you, Captain," Josephine said gratefully. "We're in your debt." "No debt," he replied gruffly. "I've no love for Blackwell or his kind. Had a brother-in-law killed by his men last year over a mining claim dispute. Anything that brings that man to justice is payment enough for me." They boarded the Mojave just as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. Ethan, leaning heavily on Josephine's arm but insisting on walking under his own power, drew curious glances from the other passengers, a mix of miners, merchants, and a few families traveling downriver. Their cabin was indeed small, with barely enough room for a narrow bunk and a tiny washstand, but it offered privacy and, more importantly, safety. As the steamboat's whistle sounded and the vessel pulled away from the Ehrenberg dock, Josephine felt the tension that had gripped her for weeks begin to ease slightly. "Next stop, Yuma," Ethan said with a tired smile as he settled onto the bunk. "And Judge Harrison." "And then home," Josephine added softly, taking his hand in hers. The journey downriver was mercifully uneventful. The Colorado rolled broad and powerful beneath them, carrying the Mojave steadily southward. Josephine tended to Ethan's wound, changed his bandages, and helped him walk briefly around the deck for fresh air. His strength returned slowly but surely, his natural resilience asserting itself despite the severity of his injury. They arrived in Yuma late the following afternoon, the settlement's adobe buildings glowing golden in the slanting sunlight. Unlike Ehrenberg, Yuma was a substantial town with a military presence due to the territorial prison located there. The captain himself escorted them down the gangplank, insisting on seeing them safely to Judge Harrison's residence on the outskirts of town. "Blackwell's influence doesn't reach as strongly here," he explained as they traveled by wagon through the dusty streets, "but it pays to be cautious." Judge William Harrison proved to be a formidable figure, tall and straight-backed despite his 60-odd years, with piercing eyes and a bearing that commanded respect. He received them in his study, listening without interruption as Josephine recounted her testimony regarding Sheriff Collins's murder and the subsequent pursuit by Blackwell's men. When she finished, The judge was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him. Finally, he nodded decisively. Miss Mercer, Mr. Jameson, what you've endured to bring this evidence forward is commendable. Daniel Blackwell has operated with impunity in this territory for too long, protected by corrupt officials and the fear he instills in honest citizens. He rose from behind his desk. I will dispatch federal marshals immediately to arrest him and his accomplices. Your testimony, properly documented, will be the cornerstone of the case against him. Will that be enough? Josephine asked. Blackwell has powerful friends. Had powerful friends, the judge corrected. The territorial governor has been under investigation by the Department of Justice for months. His association with Blackwell is one of the primary concerns. When this case breaks, many of those who protected Blackwell will find themselves facing charges as well. And until then, Ethan questioned, Blackwell still has men who will carry out his orders. You will remain under my protection, Judge Harrison assured them. My home is well guarded, and I have the authority to deputize additional marshals as needed. Once your statements are properly recorded, we can discuss your future plans. He smiled slightly. Though I gather from what you've told me that those plans involve returning to Mr. Jameson's ranch near Mineral Park. Josephine felt her cheeks warm as she glanced at Ethan. Yes, Your Honor, that's our hope. Then we shall endeavor to make it possible, the judge promised. For now, rest. You're safe here. The next week passed in a blur of formal statements, sworn testimonies, and meetings with federal officials who arrived from Tucson and even as far as San Francisco as the case against Daniel Blackwell took shape. Josephine recounted her experience dozens of times, each retelling bringing fresh pain, but also a growing sense that justice might finally be served. Ethan recovered steadily under the care of Dr. Martinez, regaining his strength and mobility. By the 10th day of their stay, he was able to move without assistance, though the wound would take weeks more to heal completely. On the evening of their 14th day in Yuma, Judge Harrison summoned them to his study, his expression more satisfied than they had yet seen it. I've received word from the federal marshals, he announced without preamble. Daniel Blackwell has been arrested along with 14 of his associates, including Frank Miller and 3 corrupt officials from Prescott. The evidence collected, combined with your testimony, Miss Mercer, leaves little doubt as to the outcome of their trials. The relief that flooded through Josephine was so intense she had to grip the edge of the judge's desk to steady herself. Ethan's arm came around her waist, supporting her as the news sank in. It's over, she asked, hardly daring to believe it. The legal proceedings will continue for some time, the judge cautioned, but yes, the immediate danger has passed. Blackwell will remain in custody until his trial, and his organization is being dismantled as we speak. He smiled, the expression softening his austere features. You are free to return home if you wish. Home, the word echoed in Josephine's mind as she looked up at Ethan. His eyes, warm and filled with promise, met hers. Yes, she said softly. We'd like that very much. The journey back to Mineral Park took nearly 2 weeks, proceeding at a measured pace to accommodate Ethan's still healing wound. They traveled by steamboat back upriver to Ehrenberg, then by stagecoach to Prescott, and finally by hired wagon for the last leg to Ethan's ranch. As they crested the final rise, the small homestead came into view below. Josephine held her breath, half expecting to find it destroyed by Blackwell's men in retribution. Instead, the building stood intact, though weathered by the weeks of abandonment. It's still standing, Ethan said, wonder and relief mingling in his voice. Jacob, Josephine guessed. He must have kept watch over it somehow. Sure enough, as they drew closer, they found evidence that someone had been checking on the property. The livestock had been tended, water brought to the garden, and a note pinned to the door. Welcome home. Debts paid in full. J&C that night, after cleaning the dust from the house and making it habitable once more, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the Arizona landscape. Ethan's arm encircled Josephine's shoulders, drawing her close against his side. It's not much, he said, gesturing to the modest ranch spread before them. But with time and work, it's perfect, Josephine interrupted, turning to face him. Because it's ours. Ethan's eyes, silver blue in the moonlight, studied her face with an intensity that made her heart quicken. Ours, he repeated softly. I like the sound of that, but to make it official. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, simple ring, a band of silver with a single small sapphire. I got this in Yuma, had to guess at the size. Josephine stared at the ring, then at Ethan, her eyes filling with tears. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Josephine Mercer, Ethan said, his voice suddenly formal despite the intimate setting. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? To share this land, this life, whatever comes our way. Yes, she whispered, watching as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Yes, I will. His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the promise of a shared future, no longer fugitives, but partners in the life they would build together. 2 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in Mineral Park, with Jacob Turner and, surprisingly, Carlos Redhawk in attendance. Judge Harrison himself traveled from Yuma to perform the ceremony, bringing news that Daniel Blackwell had been convicted on all counts and sentenced to hang. Justice has been served, the judge told them at the modest reception afterward. Thanks in no small part to your courage, Mrs. Jameson. Josephine, still growing accustomed to her new name, smiled up at her husband. We're just looking forward to a quieter life now, Your Honor. Then I shall leave you to it, the judge said with a knowing smile. Though somehow I doubt that two spirits as adventurous as yours will settle for quiet for long. In the years that followed, the Jameson Ranch flourished under their joint care. Ethan's knowledge of cattle and land management, combined with Josephine's head for figures and organization, to create a prosperous operation that gradually expanded beyond the original 20 acres. Their first child, a son they named William after Judge Harrison, arrived a year after their marriage. A daughter, Emily, followed 2 years later. Their home, once a simple bachelor's cabin, grew along with their family, additional rooms added as needs required. Josephine never returned to work as a telegraph operator, but she found her skills useful in managing the ranch's correspondence and accounts. She also became known in Mineral Park for her willingness to teach reading and writing to any who wished to learn, holding informal classes in their home during the winter months when ranch work slowed. Ethan's wound healed completely, though the scar remained a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing everything before it had truly begun. On the anniversary of their escape from Blackwell's men each year, they would sit on their porch after the children were asleep, watching the stars and giving thanks for the life they had found together. On one such evening, 10 years after they had first met, Ethan took Josephine's hand in his thumb brushing over the simple ring he had placed there a decade before. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Coming west, all the danger you faced. Josephine looked out over their land, the healthy cattle grazing in the distance, the garden with its rows of vegetables, the sturdy house that echoed with their children's laughter during the day. Then she turned to her husband, the man who had once discovered her hiding in his barn and offered her safety instead of turning her away. Never, she said, leaning against his shoulder. Not for a single moment. Ethan's arm tightened around her as they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the Arizona territory that had become their home, a home built on courage, trust, and a love that had been forged in the crucible of danger but had emerged stronger for the trial. You're welcome in my house, Ethan murmured, echoing the words he had spoken so long ago when he had carried her, wounded and frightened, across his threshold. Josephine smiled, turning her face up to his. Always, she whispered before his lips met hers, sealing once again the promise that had begun in a barn and would endure for all their days.